Okay, thanks for joining me for this little video, which is for us to talk about how we lost the body from our Christian faith, our understanding of what it means to be Christian and to follow Jesus. So it's a little bit of a sad history of our alienation from our physical selves. And I will rattle through some of the thinkers and philosophers and theologians who have left us with a belief system that mostly disregards or undervalues the body. So asceticism is a belief that as we deny our physical desires, we can attain some kind of spiritual ideal. And it has its origins in ancient Greece. And a lot of the thinking that we'll talk about now comes from the Greek philosophers. So you will all have heard of Plato. He was around in the sort of, he was born in 347 BC. So he was around 2, 3, 4 centuries before Christ. And he was the philosopher who introduced the idea that there was a hierarchy of being. And in his understanding of that hierarchy, our reason, our capacity for reason was primary, and then spirit, and then the appetites and desires of our body. So he introduced this sort of hierarchical way of framing what the aesthetic thought had sort of already introduced. So this causes us to sort of ask ourselves, who is the real me? What does it mean to be me, to be human? So the Greco-Roman belief was that souls pre-existed bodies in some sort of state of bliss, and that then souls became trapped in flesh. So souls pre-existed the body and then got sort of held, imprisoned in the flesh of body. So according to this understanding, the real person, the core of the person, is not found in the body, but it's found in consciousness. Then along came Aristotle. He was a student of Plato, so sort of contemporary, a little bit later than Plato. And he did a lot of work around classifying all kinds of things, actually. And he classified the soul as separate from the body. So he made this distinction. The soul is separate from the body. And then around the 3rd century BC, we see the Stoics continuing the flow of Greek philosophy. And according to Stoicism, knowledge is the highest good, and physical life is lesser. So to be a wise person is to be impervious to pleasure or pain, not affected by your physical experiences, because knowledge, so you remember Plato with reason, knowledge is the highest good. Now, Gnosticism sort of is a way of thinking that we see throughout history, and that sort of appeared around this time, which is the belief that the physical world is evil or deficient. And the implications of that is that salvation is for the soul alone. So the understanding of salvation, according to Gnosticism, is that it's the soul that's being saved. The body is temporary, it's not essential to your personhood. Now, when I say salvation, the Gnostic thought is that salvation is achieved by grasping the right knowledge, which is gnosis. So that's the word for knowledge. So if you can achieve the right knowledge, if you can believe the right thing, this sound familiar at all? You will be saved. Now, 25 years before Christ was born, he didn't just appear, delivered by a stork, we see that Philo was around, and he was a Jew. He lived in Egypt. And what he was trying to do was he was trying to take Greek thought and make sense of Jewish thought in light of the thinking that came out of Greece. And what he posited was that the body is a source of calamity for the soul. So again, kind of solidifying this idea that the body is a tomb or a prison for the soul, is a source of calamity for the soul. So that was what Philo thought. And then we move into a sort of neo-Platonic way of thinking, which is building on Platonic thought. So this is kind of 2nd century. And this is the idea that if God is immaterial and God is divine, God is good, he's a source of light, then the material world is therefore darkness, evil. So it's kind of putting in contrast to one another the idea of God being goodness, light, divinity, and immaterial. Therefore, everything that is material, the created world, our bodies, is a source of evil. That was the 2nd century. 3rd century, there was a Persian philosopher called Mani, and we get a philosophy from him which is just building on this whole idea that the material world is evil. And then 354, Augustine is born, and he's the Algerian theologian philosopher who became the Bishop of Hippo. So many of us are familiar with Augustine. You know, he wrote Confessions and has been a very influential thinker within Christian tradition. And he, again, elevated reason as the part of the self that rules the body. So the body and its desires, he wrote a lot about sexual temptation. The body and its desires are always leading us astray, always leading us towards sin and away from God. So extremely influential theologian, writer, thinker, so saw reason as ruling the body. Again, following him, we've got a Turkish Catholic theologian, Gregory of Nyssa. He was sort of putting forward the idea that bodies are second best, but this is nothing new to us by now, right? Because now we're hearing this is the theme of thinking, was that bodies are second best. I mean, actually, that's better than bodies being evil. Thomas Aquinas, he was around in the 13th century. He's an Italian Dominican friar, a Catholic priest, a philosopher. He said, no, humans need a body. Without a body, humans have no experience. So there's this sort of sounds at the moment in our history lesson like a bit of a lone voice coming through. Humans need a body. Without a body, we can't experience anything. But he was followed by Descartes, and Descartes, who we know is a French mathematician, scientist, and philosopher. So he was around the late 1500s into the 1600s. And he really sliced human beings down the middle. He said, no, we are material and immaterial. The material part of us is actually seen as unnecessary and really a hindrance to fullness of life. And he was the one who coined the phrase, I think, therefore I am. So our thinking, our non-physical consciousness is actually what makes us us. And then a bit later in the 1800s. Actually, Karl Barth died only in 1968, so very recent. He was a Swiss Protestant theologian, and he coined the phrase ensouled bodies and embodied souls. So this is more integrated, but still there's this subtle hierarchy that the body is less than. And even with secular thinkers, so during the 1970s, feminist thought was becoming more prominent. Simone de Beauvoir was one of the sort of recognized thinkers and writers on feminism. And along with others, she saw the body as an obstacle to freedom. So the female body sort of as where the feminine soul is kind of entrapped within this lowly female body. So the body seen as an obstacle to freedom. And probably because we're covering so much ground so quickly, you'll hear that way of thinking didn't come from nowhere. That's really building on this whole history of how people have thought about the difference between the body and the sort of non-physical parts of a person. So this kind of suppression of what it is to be embodied, either we sort of suspect the body as a secret place of sin, like somehow the body is a weak and dark source of temptation, entrapment, and leads us to sin. And so the body becomes a focal point for our guilt. We attach guilty feelings to physical experiences. Or if that's not the result of suppressing our embodiment, or we consider the body merely a physical thing, but it's entirely separated from the spiritual and the divine. And it leads us to have an inward focus that assumes that the self is somehow inside and my physical experience is distinct from that. And this way of thinking leads us to be unable to recognize the body as the source of anything or the sign of anything spiritual. Certainly doesn't attach any divine image thinking to being in a body. And this kind of concept of, I'll say it in the masculine because that's how you will have heard it, the spiritual man, this idea of the spiritual man, has really gone virtually unchallenged through Christian tradition. So this is what could be called excarnation as opposed to incarnation. This is where Christianity is kind of disembodied. It's turned into a belief system and it reduces any vision of the whole person. So it's contra-incarnational. It's against what it is to be incarnational. So what it says is that what you do with your body has little significance. It won't really affect who you are. It's not really relevant because the important thing is the non-physical part of who you are. So just quickly, there's three ways of sort of conceiving what the human being is. One would be known as dualism. So that's the idea that humans are composed of two parts. So that's the material body and the non-material soul. And we've talked about that. There's a subtle implication there that body things, anything related to a body, is a means to an end. So the body is temporary, the body is somehow flawed, and so anything related to the body that you do as part of your Christian walk is just a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So there's this hierarchy that still remains, which is that the most important thing is that something inside changes. And the desire that we have is to somehow separate our soul from the weakness of our body and grow our inner being, quite unrelated to our physical being. So that's dualism. And then we've got monism, which is a much more recent way of conceiving of the body, which is really saying that another word for it would be physicalism. So it's saying that a human being is just one thing, it's just physical. It's a much more unified way of thinking about humanity, but you might react to it. So Francis Crick was a proponent of physicalism, monism. He was a British scientist he died in 2004. So very recent. He said, your sense of personal identity is nothing more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells. So this could be called reductive materialism. It's reducing the person to just material things. So your personality, your emotions, everything about who you are is a result of atoms. It's a result of your nervous system and how that causes you to think and create habits, and it's a whole science there. So some Christians would find it difficult to sign up to monism, but there are theologians who are leaning this way. And then there's what we would call trichotomism, which is really the body, soul, spirit belief. So you have a body, you have a soul, you have a spirit. But again, there's a subtle sense of hierarchy in that, which is that, the spirit, and I've been on training courses where this is taught. The spirit is sort of managing, should be leading your soul and your body, which are less than. So we will consider if that's biblical. And the question I want to leave you with is, who is the real you then? So to what extent do you think of you as someone who is separate from your body? This physical body that walks and talks and breathes and sweats, especially on a day like today. To what extent do you think of the core of you, the real you, as somehow different from this physical you? That's something to be thinking about, maybe something to journal about. And then to what extent do you see your spiritual life, in inverted commas, as distinct from your body? Have you grown up in your Christian walk to see your spiritual life as something different from a body that is hungry and thirsty and bleeds and sweats? Think about that. David Benner is a Christian author, and he has said that alienation from our bodies is a form of alienation from God, from one another, and from creation. This sense that we're not quite in touch with what it is to be physical, that we don't honour what it is to be physical. So what does that look like? Well, I think it looks like clergy that are run ragged with fatigue. I think it looks like those of us who call ourselves messengers of the good news, living unhealthy lifestyles that speak a different message to the good news that we say we profess. And I think it looks like seeing our bodies as tools, primarily containers for the stuff that is within them. So what would integration look like for us? We're going to look at that. How might we walk in the daily tension of discerning how our body experiences might lead us towards God and away from God as integrated whole beings? So we're nearly at 20 minutes. I'm going to leave it there. I hope that's provoked some thought for you. And I'd love to hear your comments. I'm going to post this in the group, and I'd love to hear your comments, questions, wonderings, thoughts. Enjoy.